Greetings, ladies, gentlemen, and interdimensional beings. Welcome to Our Lady of Quality Content. My name is Eve. I tell stories and have opinions about things. Today is story time, and we're going to talk about Ariadne and the Labyrinth. We've all encountered stories of the Labyrinth, a giant, supposedly unsolvable maze that the hero has to somehow navigate their way through. Maybe we've encountered it through the eyes of J.K. Rowling or Jim Henson. The less fortunate amongst us may even have encountered the folk tradition of the corn maze. But the labyrinth isn't only literal, a set piece, or, God forbid, an actual place. It's also an idea, a symbol of the difficulties of navigating the world we live in, of the trials and terrors of love, and even of the mysteries of the inner self. But don't worry, this isn't going to be some snotty literary ramble much. I did promise story time, and today is the story of the original Labyrinth and the girl at its center, the Princess Ariadne. You may have heard of this story under a different title, the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. And no disrespect to centuries of writers and literary critics, but that title is inaccurate and it's wrong. The real story is the story of Ariadne. But like every true princess tale, the story of Ariadne has to begin with a truly disastrous family. Ariadne was the daughter of King Minos of Crete and his wife, the goddess Pasiphae. We'll start with Minos, because every story needs a villain, and while this one has several, Minos is my least favorite. Problem number one with King Minos was his father. Probably the worst character in all of Greek mythology. Say it with me. Zeus. Imagine if the president of a Yale fraternity managed to get himself off Nantucket long enough to climb Mount Olympus. That boy is Zeus. Zeus had a little bit of a problem. And by that, I mean that women had a little bit of a Zeus problem. The whole tragedy begins when Zeus leaves off lifting weights with PJ and Squee long enough to go a-courting on Earth. And by a-courting, I mean he picked a pretty mortal woman and kidnapped her. This was pretty regular behavior for him. This time around, Zeus's chosen victim was a lovely young lady named Europa. You may have heard of her. Europe is named after her, but I'm not getting into that because I don't know why. Europa's actual fate was much less shitty than the fates of other women kidnapped by Zeus. He seems to have been at least a little bit fond of her because after he was done with her, he deposited her and their 3 demigod sons, Minos and the other 2, on the beautiful and wealthy island of Crete, where they were adopted by the first king of Crete, whose name I don't care about. Zeus declares that they will be the future heirs to Crete. And then some time passes and suddenly Minos is king of Crete. But it's clear that Minos knows that his kingship is on shaky ground because he decides to make a deal. He calls on his uncle Poseidon, king of the seas, and he asks him for a favor. Unc, he says, I need to convince these people that I'm supposed to be in charge of them. It's like this. Gods require sacrifice, for reasons, but Poseidon sees the opportunity for a top-notch sacrifice here. Poseidon says, yeah, sure, whatever. I have no skin in this game. You can be king if you want. And I know what'll really impress the populace. So Poseidon makes this beautiful white bull, we mean bull as in male cow, appear out of the pearly foam upon the wine dark sea or whatever, on the shore of Crete, in front of a bunch of Minos' people who are all like, ooh, divine right to rulership. It's great. Everyone's happy. for a second. Minos sees the bull and he thinks, that's a really nice bull. I like stuff, and I like this, and I'm putting it in my bull collection, and I'm not giving it back. Now the deal here was that when the bull appeared, Minos would sacrifice the bull right back to Poseidon. Poseidon gets whatever the gods get out of sacrifice. Minos gets the sign, he gets to be king without people being like, yeah, why are you king? And everyone's happy. But that is not what happened because Minos likes stuff. So he just tries to pull a fast one on one of the kings of the gods. And he's like, here, Poseidon, I have very many nice bulls. So here is one of those nice bulls for you. And Poseidon's like, this isn't my bull. And it wasn't. And Minos said, well, I'm not giving that one back because it looks nice in my bull collection and people are very impressed with my bull collection. You can see how this really is an asset to the people of Crete. So Poseidon didn't like that. But because Minos is a powerful white man, the curse doesn't come down on his head. Instead, Poseidon's revenge falls on Minos' wife, the queen Pasiphae. Before we move on here, I just want to have a brief discussion about one of the most important questions in this story. Did Minos marry out of his league? From a relationship standpoint, well, we're gonna have to talk about Minos because he was gross. Now, in most versions of the myth, he's really only portrayed as being gross of spirit, but what we need to talk about is how he was also gross of face. His skin is splotchy and saggy, a mix of jaundiced orange and pale, sickly white. His hair is a limp thing, the color and consistency of wet straw. His broad shoulders are in grotesque proportion with his tiny hands. He talks like a mob boss, he gestures like a used car salesman, and he walks like he has a grudge against the ground. Am I painting a picture for you? Now, not much has come down to us about Pasiphae in the stories. We have no solid evidence that she was clever, sophisticated, likable, but we have no reason to doubt that. We do know, for sure, that she was beautiful, because somehow writers always remember to mention that. I think it's pretty safe to say that on an interpersonal basis, Minos and Pasiphae were poorly matched. During the time when he was waiting for Poseidon's sign, Minos was slowly hoarding the truly disgusting amount of gold he needed to pay Helios her dowry. And so, Helios sold Pasiphae to Minos. And they were married. And so, through no agency of her own, Pasiphae came into the path of Poseidon's curse. Ariadne was born a few years after the curse came down on her family. Ariadne heard stories of her own birth from her wet nurse, but she heard another story of another birth in the same palace when she was a little girl. She wasn't supposed to be listening, but she didn't know much about her mother, so when she heard two maidservants bandying about her mother's name, she stopped behind a curtain to listen. The story she heard was this. A curse had fallen on Pasiphae, inflaming her with lust for the very white bull that Poseidon had sent to Crete, and that Minos had refused to sacrifice. Pasiphae went to her husband's resident engineer, a man you may have heard of, his name was Daedalus, and cajoled or possibly blackmailed him into making a mechanical cow that she could hide in order to have her way with the animal. A few months later, I won't say 9 because mystical situations get dicey, screams were heard throughout the palace as Pasiphae underwent the trial of giving birth to the half-bull, half-man beast that the peasants jokingly called the Minotaur, Minos' bull. Ariadne was shocked to hear this story. She had never suspected that she and her brother Androgeos had an elder sibling. Now, her uncle Daedalus had been spearheading some mysterious, gigantic construction project out in the palace grounds, and Ariadne had a sneaking suspicion. She ran to the construction site and pulled on her Uncle Daedalus's tunic to ask him a question. "Uncle Daedalus," she said, "does my brother live?" Daedalus, to his credit, was a very clever man and had a very good poker face. He said, "Androgeos? Why, I saw him this morning." Ariadne climbed on top of a crate to whisper in her uncle's ear. "I mean my other brother," she said. "I think he's alive, and I think you're building a place for him to live in." Daedalus said nothing, which Ariadne, young as she was, knew was confirmation. So she began searching the palace. When she knew she was looking for something, hiding in the dark, out of sight, locked away, it wasn't that hard to find the cellar room where her brother was locked behind bars. After that, Ariadne visited her brother every day, and when he was placed in the labyrinth, well, she missed him. Well, we're going to cut away from that sack of sad for a minute and talk about a character who's about to enter the scene, and I'm going to need a drink for that. You know, this was water. I hope he's thinking about what he's doing. So, the hero Theseus of Athens. Like Minos, Theseus had an asshole father that he could trace his history of assholery to. Theseus' asshole father was Aegeus, king of Athens. He had a child with a country woman, left her to return to Athens, didn't marry her, and said, "Well, you're going to have a child. I'm not going to send him money or anything, but what I will do is bury a pair of shoes and a sword under a rock, and if it's a boy and he ever gets strong enough to lift the rock, then he can put on the shoes and the sword and come to Athens to claim me as his father." So, Theseus had no daddy issues and was fine. Of course, this being a hero story, it was a boy. It was Theseus. He was very strong, and when he was a teenager, he lifted the rock, took the shoes and sword, and decided to go to Athens to claim Aegeus as his father. Now, his mom said, "Oh son, I'm so happy for you. Here's a ticket to a boat that will take you to Athens quickly and safely." And Theseus said, "Absolutely not. There's no honor in safe and efficient travel. I will go the circuitous and dangerous footpath to Athens, and I will slay every bandit who comes in my way." Which he fucking did. So he gets to Athens, and he's wearing his shoes. He looks fine in his shoes. Now, Aegeus has an advisor he gained fairly recently, in the last couple of years. A woman we know as Medea, Pasiphae's niece. Medea knows right away who she's looking at when Theseus comes to the palace. And she doesn't want anyone challenging her authority over Aegeus, or taking her place in Aegeus' heart. So she tries to poison Theseus. With Aegeus' permission, she convinces him it needs to be done. Doesn't tell him who Theseus is, of course. You know, women. But right as Theseus lifts his poisoned goblet to toast the health of the king sees his sword, and I guess it looks different than other swords.
I've never seen its equal.
Because Aegeus knocks the goblet out of his hand, because that's my son and I don't want him poisoned, and Medea flees back to daddy, and then is fine, because she's fine. Anyway, then Aegeus gleefully claims Theseus as his son, because I guess he didn't already have more sons after that, which seems unlikely, but I mean, likely things don't make great stories. So this is all a very joyous occasion, but It's marred by something awful that happened in and then to Athens only a few months before. Androgeos, Ariadne's older brother, the crown prince of Crete, had sailed.
I'm sailing! I'm sailing! I'm sailing!
Over to Athens to partake in, it was like rich people Olympics, some Athenian games with some other princes from all around Greece. Aegeus had not been particularly circumspect in choosing the games that the elite boys of his entire country would be playing. And he decided there would be a lot of honor in hunting a massive, incredibly dangerous wild boar. Unsurprisingly, this boar killed some people, and Androgeos was one of those people. Now Minos was a self-styled deal maker. And what does a deal maker like Minos do when he loses his profits so spectacularly? Well, when those profits are a secure future for his country and the love of his eldest child, all bets are off. So, Minos decided to use his own misfortune as a weapon against the people of Athens. He decides to use the Minotaur at the center of the labyrinth that Daedalus has now long completed as his tool for retribution against Athens, and demands the yearly sacrifice of 7 sons and 7 daughters of Athens' elite, because he is nothing if not extra. Well, as soon as Theseus hears this from his new father Aegeus, his hero, he immediately thinks, this is my chance to prove myself. He says, Dad! And Aegeus says, yes, son! And they stare into each other's eyes for a moment. And then Theseus says, I will go. I will be one of the sacrificed children in the labyrinth. And Aegeus is like, yeah, sounds great. Let's actually send all of these kids to die in the labyrinth, and Theseus, you can go too. But, because I guess we're supposed to assume Aegeus loves his son, he says, please, if you manage to slay the Minotaur and come home as you've promised, change the black sails on your death ship.
I sail! I'm a sailor! I sail!
To white sails, so I will know you are not dead. And Theseus says, yeah, Dad, totally, I'll remember that. Ariadne is understandably disturbed by her father's foray into madness and his insistence upon forcing her brother to become a cannibal. She stands at her parents' side as they solemnly, or in Minos' case, gleefully, greet the doomed children of Athens. Now, the stories and the story diverge on this point. When you read the stories, they'll all tell you that the beautiful Princess Ariadne saw the manly form of Theseus and was immediately struck with Cupid's bolt and vowed to do whatever she could to help the love of her life survive. No, thank you. The stories are wrong. The story goes like this. Ariadne loved her brother, but she knew he was doomed. She knew there was no life for him outside of the maze. There was life ahead of these 14 young people from a foreign city she had never seen, but hoped one day to see. They were beautiful, they were wealthy and sophisticated like her, and she didn't see a lot of people her own age. She wanted to talk to them. She wanted to make friends. She wanted to go somewhere. She didn't want them to die. And so she said to herself, whatever it takes, I am going to save them from the labyrinth, and I'm going to save my brother from a fate worse than death. So she went to Uncle Daedalus. Now Daedalus loved Ariadne like a daughter, but Daedalus knew that when Ariadne came asking questions, especially questions about her half-brother the Minotaur, things were about to get worse. Ariadne went to Uncle Daedalus and she said, "We can't let them die. Give me a way for their prince Theseus to lead them out of the labyrinth." So Daedalus walked over to his workbench and picked up a simple ball of twine. He said, "Tell Theseus to tie this to a post outside the labyrinth and to unwind it behind him as he navigates the maze. When he finds the center, he can simply navigate his way right back out." Ariadne felt pretty silly when he handed her the ball of twine, but she said, "Thank you," and kissed him on both cheeks, and said, "When Theseus is free, you and Icarus will come with us." That night, she went to Theseus's room. Theseus may have gotten the wrong idea from this, and that's probably where the stories got their impression. What really happened was this. She handed Theseus the ball of twine, she gave him Daedalus's instructions, and she said, "Bring all your brothers and sisters home." Theseus, of course, was thrilled. Theseus thought, "I can slay the Minotaur and bring home a princess as my bride." He didn't say this to Ariadne, though. He just embraced her and thanked her and went to sleep happy. If you've ever seen Wishbone, you know what happened next. Theseus tied the twine to a post outside the labyrinth. He used it to navigate the maze. At the center, he found the Minotaur and slayed him with his bare hands and led the other children out of the labyrinth, incidentally taking credit for the idea of the twine. An enraged Minos was forced to let him and the other Athenians go home safely. Ariadne was on that ship. Daedalus and Icarus were not. Minos threw them into the labyrinth as punishment for what was clearly Daedalus's failure to create an effective maze. Theseus promised to make Ariadne his bride. Her response to this hasn't come down to us, but it's safe enough to assume that she thought that at least practically this was a good idea for her. I mean, queenship is about as close to safety as a woman could come in ancient Greece. So we have to assume she agreed. And we have to assume that this terrified Theseus, because they stopped on an island on their way back to Athens. Ariadne fell asleep on the beach, and Theseus forgot to wake her when they sailed away. Look, Ariadne could easily have died on that island, and in some of the stories, she did. But in some of the stories, the story has come down to us. Ariadne awoke, alone and terrified, and ran back and forth on the beach, crying out for Theseus, for the other children of Athens she had befriended on the voyage, for the gods, for her parents, and no one answered for a while. Finally, though, one of the gods woke up, shook his hangover off, and came to her aid. Bacchus, the best god, the god of drinking, dancing, partying, theater, and the less classy poetry. He always wore leopard print, and his followers ate men alive, literally. Bacchus heard Ariadne's call, and eventually he came for her. She was somewhat surprised that it was Bacchus who had chosen to be her patron, but not only can beggars not be choosers, but a mortal doesn't have the option to refuse the aid of a god. And Ariadne didn't want to. She knew it was time for a change. So it was with a glad heart that she went away with Bacchus to join his followers, the Bacchae. Now those among you who are deep nerds may have heard of the Euripides play, the Bacchae, which is about a Theban king who goes out into the wilderness to negotiate with the Bacchae and gets eaten by them instead. I mean, there's a plot too, but this is the point. The Bacchae were famous for their wild appetites. They lived in a constant dithyrambic state, a state of mad poetic joy brought on by substances and, all the stuff the beat poets liked. In their frenzies, they were known to kill men with their bare hands and eat them raw. This was the cult that Ariadne joined. The people she left behind, well, most of them had undeserved good lives. Theseus went on to be a hero in many a story, to found democracy in Athens, and to generally be considered a great guy. Minos lived a long life, and when he made his way down to the underworld, he joined his brothers, and the three of them make up the panel that judges souls as they descend. This is proof that qualifications for judges have been on decline for centuries. We don't hear much from Pasiphae, but Madeline Miller in her novel Circe, which again you may have read if you're a deep nerd, says that Pasiphae returned to the halls of her father Helios, where she lorded herself over the nymphs and tried to forget the tragedy of her past. But Ariadne's fate was both her tragedy and the consummation of the rage she had tried so hard to suppress, the rage that built in her as she saw the unfairness of the world to women and the marginalized again and again, as she saw the death of her brother, and as she saw her own abandonment on that shore. That Theban king walked into the mountains to speak with the Bacchae and met only wild destruction. He met a sea of rabid faces, covered in blood and wine, and ready to dismantle everything that society held dear, one fingernail at a time. And in that sea of faces was the beautiful, enraged face of the Princess Ariadne. Thank you for joining us, and as we say on Our Lady of Quality Content, never let go of a flailing dog. In the footnotes down below, you'll find links to our social media accounts and to a GOODREADS list where I put my sources and sundry related books for each episode. Please do whatever it is that the YouTube algorithm most values as a metric, and join us next time when we'll be talking about whatever I feel like talking about. Thank you.